Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to the first get together or showcase of the year for the Hunt Living Histories. I'd just like to acknowledge that we're meeting on the traditional lands of the Awabakal people, the Newcastle tribe of Newcastle, and we pay our respects to their elders, both past, present and emerging. And I wish to extend that respect to the Aboriginal people of the lands you're all zooming in from today, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging.
So one of our presenters today is Dr Jeannine Baker, who's a lecturer in Humanities, Creative Industries and Social Sciences at the University of Newcastle. Jeannine's an award-winning feminist media historian with a research focus on gendered labour and technology in the Australian and British media industries. I've added to the blog post, Jeannine was involved in a media studies grant in 2021 where it was a partnership with the National Film and Sound Archive and did some great oral histories on some of the women in media and particularly behind the scenes in media. And Jeannine won 2022 Oral History Australian Media Award. Also involved in a British Academy Visiting Fellow at the University of Sussex on a project that was Connected Histories of the BBC, and again that was looking at pioneering women. And yeah, we're really fortunate to have Jeannine at the university. She's worked with some of our students, currently got a few podcasts that relate to the history of the region. So we thought it would be great to have you come along today and just share a little bit about your current work, Jeannine.
Thank you so much. Thanks for the invitation to talk to you. Can you hear me okay, everybody? Yeah. Just give me, I don't know, warn me if I'm going over time. So I know you said 15 minutes or so, so I'm not actually quite sure how long this is, but I can rabbit on a bit too much. So just, yeah, give me the wind up if I'm going on too much. I'll just share my screen with you. Where am I? This one? Okay, can you see that slide okay? Yes, no?
Yes.
Talk to me, people. Okay, cool. So yeah, as Anne said, my particular expertise or my particular interest really is in women's work in the media. So I wrote a book a few years ago now about women, Australian women war reporters. Hopefully you've got that at the library. So I started looking at women in print media, but then moved across to looking at broadcasting. So I've written various articles about women in radio, and women in TV is my current kind of interest, particularly early television. And I'm especially interested in sort of the relationship between gendered labour and technology, and I'll talk a bit about that today. So I want to talk to you about this ongoing project, which is going on for years, about women in early television production. And one outcome of that project, as Anne mentioned, was this series of online articles, they call them, at the National Film and Sound Archive, which came out a couple of years ago now. And those stories draw on collection items. So it's built around the collection, basically using oral histories as the kind of the spine of each of the stories, and then looking at other collection items that I can bring in to kind of tell a story about that person or that event. And so not just oral history interviews, but also things like photographs and audiovisual, program clips, scrapbooks, production, sort of documentation, and that kind of thing. So I'll just show you, I think I might need to stop sharing and then go into my desktop. I'll just show that to you. Actually, that's the, hang on a sec, I think I just need to share my sound. That's the BBC one that Anne just mentioned. So this was a really massive project that the University of Sussex did with the BBC, and the whole project is called 100 Voices, that made the BBC, and I co-curated this sort of page about women at the BBC, which is a similar kind of project, again, like very much about using the BBC's oral history collection, which was kind of like very hard for people to access. It's very hard to access the BBC collection anyway, but the oral history collection was a big mess, and there wasn't often things were missing, and it wasn't well catalogued and so on. So it was a really brilliant project that took over 5 years. And so when I came to do the National Film and Sound Archive one, I was interested in doing something similar to that. So I'll just briefly show you the 5 sites or 5 stories. So the first one is about the beginning of television and looking at how we can tell that story in a slightly different way by looking at the women who were involved in the launch of TV. The second one is about women technicians, so women working in technical positions. Third one is about women producers and directors. The fourth one is about women's and children's programs. There's a lovely photograph in here of Miss Anne at NBN3. And then the fifth one is slightly different. It was just about this one woman called Rosemary Ether. I don't know if any of you remember her. She was a really huge personality on daytime television. And the reason for that is just as I was doing the project, a massive set of personal papers of hers was donated by her son to the NFSA. And so I happened to be kind of in the archive when it came in, and I got to kind of go through the boxes. And it was such a rich and amazing collection that I decided to do a whole kind of story about her, because the thing about collections is that, of course, most of them are in storage, and unless somebody wants to make a program or wants to do an exhibition or so on, then that you don't really get to see them. So it just seemed like a really good opportunity to use this wonderful collection, and I can talk a bit more about her if you like a bit later. So there are the 5 sites. I need to go to I should be able to do this in a more efficient way, but I'm just going to go back to my PowerPoint. Okay. Right, so what I wanted to do with this was, tell a new story about early Australian television, one that acknowledged the contribution that women made. And the history of Australian television is often centred on men. It won't surprise you. The brilliant, business owners and managers and personalities and so on who are seen to be the sole reason for the success and development of Australian television. And that history often ignores or it minimises, certainly, I don't think there's any dispute about that, the contribution of women. And once I started looking around the television studios, looking past the manager and the owner and so on, and looking at who's actually in the television studio, I started to see that there were women everywhere. And that's very much a feminist production studies approach, is to look at the whole production environment and consider things like the relationships between people and power hierarchies and so on. And that also is the case for the development years of, the pre-history of television is also very interesting in terms of women's involvement. I can talk about that later if you want me to. But I just want to give you one example of how you can kind of flip the script a little bit. So this is Bruce Gyngell. He's often called the first face of Australian TV, although, as has been pointed out, there's other contenders for that, including a female cook called Zena Chaplin, who was actually televised, but before the start of what's usually considered, regular broadcasting in September 1956. So Bruce Gyngell is often seen as the first person on TV. He was the person who said "Welcome to television" in September 1956 for TCN9. And the interesting thing, though, is that footage from that broadcast doesn't exist. So this image that you see here, and I'm sure that you would have seen clips of Bruce Gyngell saying "Welcome to television," anytime there's anything on TV about the start of TV, that comes from a reenactment that was done about a year after the first broadcast by TCN9, and that's why he looks a bit strange. He's kind of leaning, and that's because they shot it in this tiny little room, so they're squeezing him in. So it's this carefully crafted, curated kind of story that is then being perpetuated. And if we look a bit more carefully at the material remnants of that night, that first night, we start to see a different narrative. A different narrative can emerge, and one that sort of brings in women. So what I wanted to do in this project, and I'm going to do right now, is fade out the figure of the male auteur and bring up the picture of women members of the production team. So let's look at some of those material remnants. And so on the right here, you see a script of the opening night, and this belongs to a woman called Molly Brownless. You can see that script, right? You're going to yell it if you can't see anything that I'm talking about. So you can see here that Molly she's hand annotated the script to show where the source of the vision is, and whether she's fading or mixing the action that she's taking. So Molly was the person who brought up the picture of Bruce Gingell. She was in the control room on the first night of TV, and she sent the program to air, and she monitored the transmission to make sure that it all went off without a hitch. And she was one of the only people working at Channel 9 who had practical television experience. And that's because she had previously been an engineer at the BBC. She'd been in the engineering division at the BBC, and she was in fact the first woman camera operator at the BBC. I'm going to talk a little bit more about her in a minute. She died 2 years ago at the age of 102, and I was very fortunate to interview her. I spent 3 days with her when she was 99, and did an interview with her that's now at the National Film and Sound Archive. And so that's one thing, that's one material remnant. And another one is this daily program master log. So this is a log, a handwritten log of the first night of television. And this was made by Jean Jenkinson, who was the assistant to the head engineer, John Britton. And so Jean, she had an honours degree in physics from Sheffield University. She'd previously worked at the Museum of Applied Arts and Sciences before she worked at Channel 9. But across television, in the early years of TV, across all the stations, you see women working in technical areas. They weren't just in feminised roles that you might think of, secretarial roles. So these are some of them. They were working as gram operators, film technicians and editors. You can see here Margaret Carden was one of the very first editors for the ABC. She also cut Captain Thunderbolt, and she'd worked in the UK before she came out here, and vision switches and so on. And that's partly because in those really early years of TV, the technology was very new, it was experimental, and the stations were hungry they were desperate for staff who had any kind of translatable experience. So a lot of the first staff members came from the theatre, or from radio, or from overseas television stations, as was the case with Molly, because they had some of the kinds of skills that they wanted. And in those kind of spaces, that's where women often get jobs. And the same thing happened in early radio. Lots and lots of jobs for women doing all kinds of really interesting work because the technology was new. And so these documents suggest that women weren't insignificant. They weren't just this kind of minor, they weren't playing a minor role in television production. They were actually essential members of the production team. And they disprove this widely held belief that women were solely working in this narrow range of feminised roles. Now, it is true that women tended to be funneled into these particular work that was defined and valued quite differently to the work that men did. They tended to be low status, lower paid, and that's because the jobs, what they required was the kind of skills that are associated with domestic labour, basically. Organisation and communication, keeping people happy, caring. And so it's the men who are in the decision-making roles that we can more easily track through public archives. Women are more likely to be faceless and nameless, like this woman here working in a film library at 1807. They're in the very first year of TV. She's not named in the archive. I don't know. I've tried to find out her name, but no one's been able to tell me. And they've often left a few historical traces. And so that's why oral history is such an important methodology for scholars doing this kind of work on women's labour, because it helps us to people the spaces, people the production spaces, and to understand things like the working relationships, women's professional identity, the hierarchies that were in operation, and the practices that were enacted within these production spaces. So I want to just talk about a couple of specific women in particular. So Molly Brown is who I mentioned before. She'd worked in the engineering division of the BBC from 1941. So she started out working in a radio transmitter. And then when the war ended, she was transferred to Alexandra Palace, which is where the post-war television service was. And she worked in a range of studio engineering jobs, including vision switching and in central control, which she did at Channel 9, but also camera. And she maintains that she was on camera the first day of post-war broadcast, and that in fact she took the first televised image. There's no way to verify that, but there are photographs of her on camera, such as this one here. I was contacted a few years ago by someone at Alexandra Palace saying, "Do you know who this is?" I've showed it to the other fellas who went to Alexandra Palace, and they said it can't possibly be a woman. Can't be. And I showed it to Molly or Molly's daughter, and she said, "That's me, and I know exactly what I was filming." So it's pretty amazing. It's kind of rewriting that history. So she migrated to Australia in the early 50s, and she started working at Channel 9 when it was still in its testing phase. Experimental phase, and she was in central control, as I said. And on the website that I showed you before, I won't play it because I think I might run out of time, but there's a clip of her explaining what the job involved, and she was a little bit impatient with me even asking the question, because she just thought, well, it's obvious. I just kind of was there and I just monitored the transmissions. I made sure that everything was coming in, everything that was coming in was going out to where it was meant to, in the right way. And for her, it was kind of almost mundane. It was nothing out of the ordinary, and she was just doing her job. She didn't need to explain it. But what it highlighted to me was two really important things. One is that she just saw herself as being a small part of the team, and that's something that I've seen when I interview women, is that the being part of the team is just a really important aspect of their work. It's really key. And that is why a lot of them don't see themselves as different, because they're just a member of the team, and all the team they've got the same goal, which is to get the program out, and they all need to work, and they need to have harmony. Secondly was her familiarity with production processes and technical equipment, and she was really expert in the technical side of things. And she was actually one of the only people at Channel 9 who had this practical engineering experience, not just television experience, but engineering experience. So the head engineer had engineering qualifications, but he never worked in TV, only she had. And so when I talked to her, she recalled being at the BBC when these men came from Australia to talk to employees and basically invite them to Australia because they were looking for really experienced television staff. So Molly would have been a really good catch for TCN9. And so as well as Molly, I've found several other women who've worked in technical jobs, and I want to talk about one group of them, which is news camera stringers. But first I'm just going to mention, Pat Tia. So she was at NBN3. She joined as a film handler in 1962. And the film library was one area that typically employed young, actually teenagers. Like in 1963, they had 4 film handlers and they were all teenage girls. And Pat was one of those. But she soon took on this job of videotape operator, and that's because she had this aptitude with machinery, which was kind of legendary. So this newspaper article, Billy to the Rescue, so Billy was her nickname, was about how if anything ever went wrong in the studio, they would call for her to fix it. She was really good with equipment. And the profile describes her as being a glamorous blonde who used her feminine intuition to sense how to fix a piece of ailing equipment. And so that's an account that emphasises her femininity, because her femininity is seen as kind of not, it's not quite right, to have, a woman who's got this aptitude with machinery. So we have to also, tell people that she's really feminine as well. But it also kind of downplays her technical expertise, and it makes out like it's this kind of like mysterious and anomalous rather than something that's actually learned. And, it's these kinds of stories that change this belief that mechanical aptitude is something that's innate. It's innate in males. It's biologically determined rather than being something that's actually learned. So thirdly, I guess, I want to just mention these news camera stringers. So I've found 5 so far, and they all began in the first decade of television. So a camera stringer is basically a freelance camera operator, and they're usually hired. They'll have a contract with a broadcaster, and they work on a freelance basis, so by the job. So the broadcaster will contact a stringer to say, there's a bushfire or a flood or plane crash or whatever, can you go out and film it for the news? And they use their own equipment, their own 16mm film equipment, and they worked solo, no sound. And they were often required to cover disasters. 4 of these women stayed in the role for about 20 years until their equipment became obsolete with the introduction of electronic video equipment, which happened in the late 70s. The 5th one, Pat Davey, who's from here and around, and I've interviewed her. She was a stringer just for a year or 2, and then quite amazingly was offered a job as a full-time news camera operator, so in the studio. And I believe she was the first woman in Australia to have that role. It was previously believed that there were no women working in camera until about 1980, and that's when the first woman was employed by, actually, commercial station in Sydney, but also the ABC. They employed their first women camera assistants in 79, 80, but Pat Davey was doing it in about 68, 69. So how much time have I got, Anne?
You can keep going for a couple of minutes. Yeah.
Okay. So I will just talk about Claire Lupton as one kind of example of these women. She's super interesting. So she was working in the ABC's news department as a kind of, she called herself a kind of a gopher, but she was doing the reverses. So, on the news when you see the journalist interviewing someone and then you get the reverse kind of shot, basically the journalist nodding, that kind of thing. She would go around with the male camera operators and help them with that. But they were secretly training her up on how to use the camera equipment. And then they went to the bosses, as she put it, the head of news, I suppose, and said that Claire's ready for her camera test now. And in those days, to be a camera operator, you had to pass a test. And the test in those days was they were allocated something to film. And if what they filmed ended up on the news that night, they were in. They became a camera operator. And you can hear the whole story that Claire tells on the NFSA site. But to sum it up, they set her, the bosses were really flummoxed because they didn't want women being camera operators at all. So they set her the hardest possible test that they could think of. And that was to go out to, it's gone completely out of my head. But anyway, it was a paceway, a motor raceway, and film this motor race on the really, really hot day. And so she went out there and she said the racing car drivers were walking around with their, they wear those kind of jumpsuits, they're sort of like peeled off the top because they were so hot. So they're walking around bare-chested, and she filmed that. And then she wanted to get down the front to watch the race taking off, but she wasn't allowed. There were no women allowed down the front. So she went around the other side and got down on her tummy and filmed through the fence and got the wheels when the race started with the dust and everything. And those two shots ended up on the news that night. So then the bosses were like, what are we going to do now? And fortunately for them, I suppose, she decided to go and live in Papua New Guinea, where her sister was also living. And so they made her the camera stringer in Papua New Guinea. And then she subsequently became a stringer in New South Wales. So she was in Papua New Guinea for a few years, then she moved to Albury, and then she moved to Bega on the south coast and was a stringer for 20 odd years. And she also worked as a journalist. So she raised a family. She had 4 kids, and she talks about putting the kids in the car and driving up to a plane crash up the side of a mountain and just leaving them in the car and like walking up with her camera and filming the plane crash and coming back. And so she found it quite a good job to have as a mother, interestingly. But of course, also all of them were, the other thing to mention is they were all paid the same as men. There was no kind of female wage for this. So they got the same rate as the men did, but they were all exposed to trauma as well, and they do talk about that, seeing dead bodies and so on. I think I'd better leave it kind of there because I'm going to run out of time, but you can look on the NFSA website and read about Dorothy Hallam, who is in Tasmania. It's pretty interesting. And she made some like little films, so she was actually almost a director, really. She came up with her own material. She wasn't just doing what the ABC kind of told her to do. And the super interesting thing about Dorothy Hallam is that she made this album and she documented all of the films that she shot for the ABC, when they were screened, how long they were. There's a very wonderful self-reflexive image of her here making the album, which I love. And she started recording them off the air, and you see here this is a photograph of the title slide from the TV broadcast. And so she made this incredible, with this copper plate handwriting record of everything that then a few years ago was used by the ABC to recover all of her films because it was documented. So she's pretty fascinating. So I won't talk about Grace Gibson. I'm going to stop sharing. So yeah, lots more stories out there, and I think it's just really cool to kind of learn how women were doing much more varied work than most of us probably are aware of. Thank you.
Great stuff, Jeannine. Any questions on that presentation? Comments?
Is the link to the film and sound archive, your oral histories and that, is that going to be in a...
I've already added them to the Hunter Living Histories page for this meeting. So I did that this morning.
Great.
You can just search for The Women Who Made Australian TV. That's what the series is called, and they'll all come up.
Fabulous.
I'd just like to say I found it very insightful, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Robert.
Any other comments before we move on to our next topic? Questions? I thought it was fabulous, Jeannine. Thank you for doing all that, because it's history that can be lost. I mean, it's a very precarious medium anyway.
And Jeannine's been involved with looking through the NBN archive.
And had a research assistant. So yeah, meeting the team here, I think, has been mutually beneficial for us.
Absolutely. And so hopefully before too long there'll be, some similar pages to this, but about NBN women. So
Yeah.
Because we had a visit from one of the
That was Jen.
Jen.
Jen. She
W-
featured in the NBN archive.
She's in
Yeah.
the pile.
She knew everybody, and yeah, she's a
But was she was one of the
Welshman.
interviewees of
Wellsman.
Yeah.
We took a shot with her in front of the photograph that was in the exhibition.
Yes, I told her about that it was here, and she belongs to the Merriweather Historical Society,
It's a small
as
world.
do I, and that's where I met her and told her. I'd seen the photo.
That was great.
I've already got the clearance from the NFSA to use the clips because I had to use up my funds. So I just have to write the pages now. So it'll happen.
Well, fabulous. Thank you very much for sharing that with us today. That's
No
great.
problem.
All right. Now over to Andrew Mercado. Thanks, Andrew, for tracking you down. Sorry if I should have reminded you.
All right. It's okay.
You're an off-the-cuff guy that can come up with number 96. All right. So everyone I've spoken to about this all says the same thing. They weren't allowed to see it as children, but everyone somehow watched it. All right. So
I wasn't a child when it was on. I was.
you don't have to say that, John. So anyway,
I watched it.
so Andrew is ground zero. I mean, when I first met Andrew, I didn't know he was ground zero. I just started talking to him about number 96 because that's what you do. But I didn't realise that Andrew was ground zero for researching, curating, knowing, connecting, locating everything about this TV show, but also about Australian television as well. So these two presenters today really complement one another beautifully. So over to you, Andrew. I'll shut up and off to you because I know you've got to go.
Yeah, look, hello everyone. And look, I might pick up on what all the great information Jeannine has given us about women in television, because one of the things that people don't know about number 96 is everybody jumps to that, oh yeah, that was the show where Abigail got her clothes off. And that's actually an urban myth. I mean, number 96 was a show where a lot of women were asked to take their clothes off. They had to sign a nudity clause back then. But Abigail only ever wore a see-through top without a bra on underneath. So we need to kill that rumour. She was not getting her gear off in this show all the time. And the other really interesting thing about number 96, when you look back on it, some people go, oh, that was just a show where they kind of used the women for nudity, and they did. But this show was unique because number 96 was being written by two gay men, David Sale and Johnny White, and they based a lot of the female characters on that show on the type of heroines they saw in Hollywood movies of the 30s and the 40s that Bette Davis and Joan Crawford would have played. So if you actually take another closer look at number 96, you actually realise that in every single coupling, whether it was Les and Norma running the wine bar or Aldo and Roma running the delicatessen, the woman was always in charge of the household. She was always the one that got things done, while the husband sort of faffed around doing get-rich schemes and never really got anywhere with it. And the other thing that's incredibly unique about number 96 is that there were several characters who were self-financed career women. People like Vera Collins, played by Elaine Lee, and Maggie Cameron. I mean, these were women who, of course, because it was a soap opera, they had love affairs and they went out with disastrous men. But these women didn't actually need a man. These women were self-employed, had their own careers, lived by themselves. And you really can't find that anywhere else on TV in the 70s. If you look at all of the stuff that came out of Crawford's, for example, all of those cop shows like Homicide, Division 4, Matlock Police, that was a show being written by straight men, and, you know, women were housewives if there was a crime, or they were prostitutes or sex workers, and it was very restricted what the women characters could do. But in number 96, the gay writers of that show had really, really opened it up and were giving women more of an opportunity on TV, and that's really unique about the show. Number 96 was phenomenally popular. Here's an example of how popular it was. In the first 2 years, they had 8 tie-in paperback novels and the cookbook and the special editions of the magazine. So this show was into merchandising before merchandising was a thing. But there's really 2 parts to number 96. The show begins in 1972 when TV is in colour, and then the show converts to colour on the 1st of March 1975, of which we're approaching the 50th anniversary this year. So half the episodes were shot in black and white, half the episodes were shot in colour. And tragically, because we embraced colour TV with such gusto here in Australia, the value on black and white TV shows was considered worthless. So even though number 96 was the number 1 highest rated TV show in Australia, even though it was screening in every capital city and every regional town throughout Australia, even though they were doing things on TV for the first time in the world, anywhere, particularly with LGBT characters and all of that stuff, they literally threw away the black and white episodes. And so apart from a handful, about 20 episodes that ended up at the National Film and Sound Archive, they have all the colour episodes, but they don't have these 3 groundbreaking years where number 96 was smashing all these taboos, and the Australian viewing public was actually proving, hey, this is something I've never encountered in my life. I'm seeing this for the first time on TV, and hey, maybe this might be okay. And it's very, very sad that we've lost so many of those black and white episodes. And I know that we've been talking about, could there be any chance that somebody is still holding on to some episodes? One of the cameramen who worked there at the time took a batch home and hid them in his garage, and the relatives have them now. I did ask another keeper of the flame for number 96, Ian McLean, who does the Facebook group on it. And the story that he has been told, and what we've got to assume is the closest to the official story, is that the black and white episodes were stacked in a foyer display of Channel 10 and not in a climate-controlled room where videotape should be kept. And because they weren't in that climate-controlled room, the oxide from the tapes started leaking onto the floor. The cleaners complained, so they took all of these episodes and took them to the tip at Ryde, and we're now told that that's where the freeway was. So it seems highly unlikely, unless we ever find a supply of them from someone, that we've pretty much lost half of number 96 forever. The second half of it has been digitised by the National Film and Sound Archive, and it is going to be seen again on a streamer this year. The other really frustrating thing about this is that I discovered through my research that the episodes would screen in Sydney at 8:30 at night, Monday to Friday. They would then screen on NBN3 on Newcastle at 9:30 at night and Wollongong at 10 p.m. on Win 4. And then the next day, the Australian Broadcasting Control Board would come down and go, right, that episode you screened last night, you need to censor that. You're not allowed to say this. You're not allowed to show this. And they would demand that a censor be applied to that. And then everybody else in the rest of Australia, Melbourne saw the show the next night. Melbourne saw a censored version of the show. And I actually discovered at the Australian Archive a file that listed all of these offensive scenes that had been cut out of the show, and they were being kept on a master reel at the Australian Archive. And one of the things that would have been on that reel was the one time that the show actually admitted that they probably went too far, which was when they had a black mass. And the censors absolutely lost their mind about that and said that entire sequence has to be cut out. So it was sent to the National Archive. It was sitting there on a reel. The paperwork was supporting it. But I got people at the Australian Archive about 20 years ago to tear the place apart, and they never, ever did find those episodes, that reel of film. And it's such a shame because even the episodes that we released on DVD through Umbrella Entertainment, you can see the jump cuts in them where edits were made. And if we found some of that, we found that reel, we would have been able to restore those very, very early episodes. But unfortunately, we never found it. So we're now in this situation where we are going to get the last half of number 96 onto screens. But it's very sad for me because one of the things that happened with Australia's conversion from black and white TV to colour was, first of all, we just decided black and white was worthless and we threw away all this stuff. And indeed, the ABC were doing the same thing. They erased all of Bellbird. Who'd want to watch that show again in black and white? They just erased over it and reused the tape. So while we lost a lot of black and white TV history, it's very sad to me because by the time the show was converting into colour, I think that a conversion to colour fundamentally changed the show. Because when you've got shows, and this applies to all of the Crawford Cop shows and also The Box, that when you're making a show in black and white and it's an adult show and it's a bit sexy, it has this very gritty feel to it in black and white. When you're suddenly given almost like the keys to the kingdom and are told, hey, now you can do whatever you want in colour, what you see is this quite garish conversion to colour where people start wearing bright yellow pants and the clothes are just like, stop. I know it was the 70s, but it really is too much. And I also think that conversion to colour fundamentally changed all of those shows. They all went from serious drama to doing more comedy, some more successful than others. And I don't think it's a coincidence that within 18 months of colour TV starting in Australia, every single show that had been a hit on Australian TV in black and white was axed due to low ratings. And what were Australians watching instead? We were watching repeats of Bewitched, because we were seeing them for the first time in colour. So whilst we have half of number 96 saved, it's sad for me because I actually think that the first half was especially is more important in terms of social history to see this stuff, because what we were doing on TV here on Australian TV in the 70s, the rest of the world wouldn't touch with a barge pole. And I think it's really, really interesting that former High Court Justice Michael Kirby said to me that he believed that seeing a gay man on TV in number 96 for 5 years every night of the week, which was Don, as played by Joe Hasham, Michael Kirby believes that normalising gay men on TV helped Australia deal better with the AIDS crisis in the 80s than any other Western country. And that is what happened. We were on the ball. The moment it became known, the Hawke government jumped on it and established an AIDS committee and pushed through some really, really radical concepts. And Michael Kirby believes it's because Australia was one of the only places in the world that had seen a depiction of a gay man on TV, not for one episode, like a very special episode, which, you know, the Americans were doing on shows like All in the Family, but embedding him in the show. The gay man lived in that building. He was a lawyer. Whenever somebody had a legal problem, they came to him for help. He was a kind man. He was a nice man. And that actually helped shape views of homosexuality when it was actually illegal in Australia in the 70s. So there's an incredible social history to Number 96. It's just an absolute tragedy to me that it has been lost. But I don't know, John, do you think it's still worth running some sort of campaign and seeing if any episodes still exist?
Never say never, because you never know. Someone watching it right now has probably got them all in their garage. You don't know.
Yes. Yeah.
You might look. We've had the most extraordinary things here. When we were doing the Victoria Theatre, I mean, I for some reason was preparing material for the 3D visualizers, right? And I only scanned half of this article. I didn't know why I did that. When I scanned the rest of it, at the end of it was a footnote that the author, who was Dr. Lionel Fredman, had thanked this accountant called Bruce Brown or something like that for giving him access to 8 volumes of the original Victoria Theatre. This was a footnote in 1986. It took the Newcastle network 1 week to track this guy down in Queensland while he was on holidays. And he said to me, I've had these archives sitting in my garage for the last 30 years, been meaning to bring them down, and brought them all here. So, I mean, never say never. I mean, the magical world. So, I mean, you know, well, we can always stop cars on the Ryde Expressway and create an archaeological dig if we can know where the dump is. But it's really important stuff. But getting it out there, you never know what happens. People are funny that way, and I can't believe that Number 96 went to the dump. That's me. Every part of my being is saying impossible, you know. But anyway, that's what they sell you, and you know you know more than I. But I'm just saying, don't give up hope.
I mean, to think that Channel 10, a network that had been on the verge of bankruptcy until they decided to gamble big with Number 96, and Number 96 was such a huge hit for them, it took them to the top of the ratings for the first time in their history. It provided Channel 10 with advertising revenue that allowed them to compete with 7 and 9 and buy better shows from overseas. So they were able to buy MASH and The Waltons and The $6 Million Man, all of these shows that kept Channel 10 up on top, but then they had no thought whatsoever about the history of the show that had saved that network, and they took the episodes and threw them at the dump. I mean, it's mind-blowing to think that nobody at Channel 10 went, hang on a second, I actually think that we should save that. They just threw them away.
Well, look, with your enthusiasm, anything's possible. Thank you very much, Andrew.
Can I make
yes, of course.
a Newcastle connection?
Yeah.
Other than discussing it frequently when we were watching it, it was a big hit. So all the actors became very well known. And one of them, Elizabeth Kirkby, who played one of the characters, she moved to our region and she ran for the Australian Democrats. Yes. And she got a really high vote because she was so well known from Number 96, and she was the first Democrat in the New South Wales upper house, and she she lived in Martinsville nearby on Lake Macquarie.
Yep.
She went to Newcastle a lot. My mum knew her. She was very active. So that was a spin-off. Yeah. For the popularity of Number 96.
The ideas we were tossing around, Jeannine, you might want to come in on this, is that it got to episode 1218, didn't it?
Correct.
That's it. I always thought, well, what would 1219 episode is something, I mean, because Number 96 put Australia in this block of flats as a sort of a microcosm and enable people to interact with things that they weren't familiar with. Now, Australia needs that kind of thing now because we're sort of moving towards this sort of monoculture idea. We're getting very scared of everything around us. So is it something that, I mean, we always thought, has there ever been an idea to get students to reshape a new approach to this and see whether they could experiment with our times and do a similar kind of experiment with Number 96 rebooted episode 1219 that could somehow bring all this incompatible stuff into some sort of conversation.
Number 96 was so far ahead of its time. It wasn't just that it had the first LGBT characters on TV. It was also incredibly multicultural. Before Al Grasby even coined the term. I mean, from the moment it started, you had Jewish shopkeepers. You had the whinging Poms, the migrants upstairs, Alf and Lucy. Lucy Sutcliffe being played by Elizabeth Kirby, who, by the way, turned, I think, 104 years old the other day. She's still as sharp as a tack. She lives by herself in Scotland Island. She became the oldest woman to complete a PhD at Sydney University in her 90s. And the highest rating episode of Number 96 of all time was the night that Lucy Sutcliffe found out that the lump in her breast was benign, and that was one of the first breast cancer storylines in the world that encouraged women to do testing. So yes, incredibly multicultural. Vera was South African. There was an Indian doctor called Dr Banerjee. There was an Aboriginal hairdresser played by Justine Saunders. I mean, but when you look at everything else on TV in the 70s, here you just had this little pocket of exactly what you said, showing to everyone in Australia, this is a version of inner city Sydney, which wasn't that far from the truth to have that sort of mix of people, but it was showing everyone in Australia what we could be if you didn't just live in an all-white enclave.
Any other questions from Zoomland?
Is it likely to ever be replayed, the bit you've got?
Yeah. So it is going to come back onto a streamer this year. I'm working with them on that. I have this vision that I would like them to release a batch of episodes every week on the 50th anniversary of when they aired, because we could count down to the most infamous episode of all time, which happened in August 1975 and will happen, a 50th anniversary will be later this year, of course, when the bomb went off in the delicatessen and killed 4 characters. So yeah, you will see it somewhere in 2025. And I hope that people can appreciate how groundbreaking it is, because one of the things about it that's a bit sad for me is that you start with this episode, the first episode shot in colour 585, when the show's leaning heavily into comedy situations, and they had this sort of thing, it was almost like dramatic vaudeville. The characters had catchphrases, a lot of the characters were literally doing comedy skits within the drama. There's never ever been anything else like it on TV, but yes, it definitely will. You will see it somewhere this year on a streamer.
Thank you.
Well, we've got Andrew for 4 minutes, so ask away quickly now before he goes.
I know Erica's made a comment. Erica is one of our Working Bad Learning students. She's just made a comment she's never heard of the show, but sounds absolutely incredible.
She's too young.
To start talking about it and everything that's happening in the world. So
Erica's done the project on Rosalind Norton, and Rosalind Norton inspired that notorious episode of the one with the Black Mass, I think.
The other incredible thing about it was that nobody else in the world was doing 2.5 hours of prime time TV the way that we were. Don't forget, Number 96 was based on Coronation Street, which was a huge success in the UK. Instead of it being a street, they put the residents into a building. But the Brits were only making 2.5 hours of Coronation Street per week. We came in out of the gate and went, we're going to strip this show Monday to Friday. Nobody thought it would work, but even America couldn't churn out 2.5 hours of drama per week on TV. The most they ever did was 90 minutes with 3 episodes of Peyton Place in the 60s. So in terms of production, we invented the way to make 5 nights a week soap, which turned into Neighbours and Home and Away. And then when those shows were shipped to the UK, that made the UK TV market look lazy and slack because they could only churn out 2 episodes of Coronation Street. So the fact that you now see Coronation Street and EastEnders eventually increase their output to what they are now, 5 or 6 episodes of the week, is all because of Australia and all because of Number 96 going, get your finger out, just do half an hour every night. And in terms of production, Australia actually invented that model that's now used all over the world for 5 nights a week soap.
And Andrew, you've got a event on at Flamingos that's coinciding with.
It's we're going to look at doing another one later on in the year. That's come and gone, that one. But there will be another event with Flamingos later on this year.
Yeah, fantastic. Flamingos.
The old Lizottes.
That's right.
All right, well, look, thank you very much, Andrew, for making
Thank you.
time for us today. It's fantastic. Love your work. All right. Well, look, the funny thing with number 96 is the music would always bust you. So you had to quickly run to the TV the minute that music started for the ad break. So no one knew in the house what you were watching. Anyway, so it was good for physical fitness. That's all I can say.
It was great to hear because when I was doing my thesis on the women's movement in Newcastle, and Elizabeth Kirkby actually, she was one of the founders with my mother of the Right to Choose Abortion Coalition. So she gets mentioned. And I found online that she'd done a PhD she was no longer live at Martinsville, she's not in our area, that she'd done a PhD, which I was very impressed, but I didn't know how to contact her and I didn't. So I'm very happy to know she's still alive.
Yeah.
It's just
been interesting.
amazing.
I mean, Andrew obviously got in touch with us with the work through the MBN archive in GlamX, but it's just fascinating the sort of television history. He did the impromptu launch of Rewind for us, so he was able to put it into a national context of what film the guys were doing in there, which has been fantastic. We just realised how precious all this stuff is. I mean, given the MBN experience, and the same thing with copying over tapes, this sort of industry practice. Same thing happened with Doctor Who, and the Australian censors were again cutting the hell out of Doctor Who, and a few years ago they released 3 DVDs worth of just cuts that the censors made to Doctor Who. So, I mean, you never know with film. It's such from the archivist's point of view, it's the most endangered format of them all because it's not kept at correct conditions anywhere. And so your alternative is to digitise, and you're stuck with the digitisation of your right now rather than preserving the original in proper conditions, which will keep it for hundreds of years if stored properly, right? And then you can relax and allow digitisation techniques to improve and adapt, and you will come out with a better product. But everything that's been done to date, I mean, once the original is trashed, you're stuck with the digitised version that you did at the time, okay? So imagine if it was 1996 and you scanned a beautiful snowball glass negative at 96 dpi and then smashed the glass negative. You wouldn't be able to go back to the original. You'd be stuck with that little piddly image for the rest of eternity, and so will everyone else. So keep the original formats, look after them, keep them, and so that's what we're trying to do. If you know of any billionaires out there that need to build us a spare fridge, we'd love one, a refrigerated room so we can put these things in.
But you know what else, as well as the black and white images of number 96, when I was researching my thesis once again, there'd been a women's show about the women's movement in Newcastle on 2NURFM, a weekly show about not just what was happening, but history, various interesting histories, interviews, all gone, all that. And Fred Gregory did a Newcastle history show. They had, because the audio cassettes or whatever they did it on reel was so expensive, they just copied over the top of them.
Yeah.
I couldn't track down. I got a few scripts from the historian.
Yeah.
She kept the scripts of what she'd done.
Well, Perce Haslam did a weekly show on the Awabakal language
Yes.
and all those tapes I know were preserved in various with various people, and I've just been saying to them, don't sit on them as though they're golden treasures. You either got to store them properly or have them digitised, or else you're going to find there's nothing on those tapes anymore. So, I mean, that's the kind of work that we're trying to do here, trying to both look after the original tape as well as get it digitised and out there and look for anything that's missing. Because the Hunter Region's digital or audio-visual history goes back the earliest I think we found is 1915, which is a visit of the Prime Minister to the BHP Steelworks.
For the opening.
And the earliest film we have here is a home movie shot by the Pender family, the beekeeping Simon Pender family, from 1926, going through all their apiaries or their beekeeping areas, and also backyard playing with their dog on 16mm. So it's only wealthy people could afford that sort of technology. But it's not to say there isn't material hanging out there, but we've always made it a key thing, because that's the stuff that's in danger. Because we've got people with the expertise to understand the machines on how to keep the machines running, because we need the machines to see so the NBN stuff we've saved, or we've tried to save as much as we can, and digitised as much as humanly possible with the resources that we have. But as I've said to Phil, whatever we do is better than if we did nothing. All right. So, and then it's next generation's job. But we're living in very volatile times where people don't seem to have any respect for physical things, and so it's we've got to have that hope that there's a future.
I'm giving a talk tomorrow night on this Zelmian who stood up to the council in 1956, refusing to resign when she got married. And
Wow.
Yes, some of the data that I got from an NBN3 interview that you put online. People in the Valley's people, and they interviewed Zell, and then they interviewed Charlie Jones, who was one of the people who voted against her being allowed to stay on. But she won the vote, and then the following year he became Lord Mayor. So she was actually secretary to Charlie Jones after he'd voted against her being allowed to stay there. So they asked him about that. It's very useful. It'll be quoted.
Well, see, the creator of that show didn't even know that survived. It wasn't until the work integrated learning classes that did it tracked him down, interviewed him, and he couldn't believe that not only had the show survived, but these kids had digitised it and were writing introductions and spin-off shows about it. So they were interviewing him as part of it.
Yes.
So that's the kind of joy that money can't buy when you're dealing with students and the experience with this stuff and the creators who did it. But those interviews are fantastic because they're all these names that we've heard about. Athol Donbrain's in there, Perce Haslam is interviewed, all these people that are big regional identities that have influenced so many people, and they're interviewed for 15 minutes on things. So it's pretty wonderful stuff. And there's something about the voice and vision which is really important and moving for people. All right, so where are we on now? Any updates from the regions that you'd like to share with us from people representing community groups or heritage organisations? Can't hear you, Ross. You've got to unmute yourself.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Look, most of you would know that Mark Metricus is the chairperson for the Hunter Committee of the National Trust.
Yes.
Most of you would also be sick of hearing bad news about the old post office in Newcastle. But I bring some good news. Mark Metricus has a new friend. That friend is Jerry Swartz.
Oh, yes.
And Mark has been helping Jerry with other people get together an application for some funding under the Heritage Act. So whether they're successful with that application or not remains to be seen. But at least it's got Jerry, who has many fingers in many pies. At least it's got him thinking about the old post office. So hopefully, after a process of nothing being done for 24 years, that something will finally happen.
Fantastic. Thank you. Good news for a change.
On the issue of the National Trust and the Newcastle National Trust involvement, I've heard it was overturned, but I don't know the basis for that clear view from down in the harbour up to the cathedral. What was the basis of the upper echelons agreeing that company could build and encroach on that view? Because
I
it
don't
got
know.
overturned.
I don't know.
just
It was a
recently.
vision. It was the Spanish Steps idea of keeping that area clear so that
Yeah,
we
but it's only happened in the last last month or so. So
Do you
what
know
was
anything
the
about that,
basis of
Ross?
that being overturned?
Yes, that's right. The Hunter Development Corporation, I think it originally ruled against allowing for the increased size of the development, but I think they then appealed to the Land and Environment Court, the developer did, and they won that case.
Any other updates from the groups people want to share?
Oh, the Newcastle Family History Society are adding podcasts by the week of interesting topics. So maybe we can get the link to where you can go in and look at all these different podcasts.
Well, Jeannine's students are getting their podcasts up too on Hunter Stories. So what's the name of the family history podcast, do you know? Well, if you can
Newcastle
share it.
Family History Society podcast.
Oh, if you can,
I'll
find them.
share them.
We'll share them. That's good.
Yeah.
It's good because a lot of people are listening to podcasts. So,
Yeah.
Can I just talk about, I'm a member of the National Trust, and a magazine came out last week, and as soon as I saw that photo, I said, oh, that's Section Ho here in Wolf Street. But in fact, it's not. It's one of the many buildings in Potts Point and around that area, but designed, I looked it up, by the same person, Emil Soderston, who designed our Section Ho as well. And just by chance, in the Newcastle Herald on Saturday, Mike Scanlon wrote an interesting article about our Section Ho. And I rang him last night because someone had given me this. And yes, he didn't realise that there was a building almost exactly the same. I'm going to have a look at it when I go home today, actually, to have a look at it, almost exactly the same as our Section Ho. And it was interesting because it used to be Torrens title. They didn't have strata title. And I think that it was the first time they had what they call flats, and people would buy into them, whereas before, in these high-rise buildings, they could only rent them, whereas now all of a sudden you could buy them. And then things changed from Torrens title paying into strata, which is what you pay if you live in a unit today. So I just thought that was interesting.
fantastic.
Yeah,
Thank
I'll
you,
just share
Suzanne.
the link that we've got on Hunter Living Histories to Section Ho, because it was put on the State Heritage Register a few years ago, and this group put a bit of history behind it.
And the founding mother of Newcastle University,
Yes.
I sent you a little article
Yes,
about Mabel Wiley.
Yep.
She and her husband lived in the Section Ho apartments.
There you go. There's the connection. And that's a good segue to the UON 60 posts that we've been putting up online. So the university celebrates its 60th year from its university birth in 1965 as an autonomous institution. Obviously, the university is an amalgam of a number of educational institutions. So we've been trying to capture all those various histories that we're running concurrently. So we've created a post on the Newcastle University College, which was founded in 1951. Now, that was good because Jeff Barkan, who's the son of Alan Barkan, sent through a picture that his mother took, Beryl, at her graduation. And that photo was a colour photo. So we were just dazzled that it was a colour photo from 1951. But what it ended up doing was helping us identify all those photos that we had from 1957, which had mistakenly in the university official history been identified as the opening in 1951. So that was 1957. So then we triggered a return back to the boxes and found all the original images, because the ones from the launch had a flag on the table, and we redigitized and were able to sequence them beautifully well from the Herald's detailed reports of what happened that day. When the procession started, who was in the procession, what they were wearing, but as you can see, they're all black and white images.
Was it at Tyes Hill?
This is at Tyes Hill, and in addition, we had the original recordings, which 2NUR FM digitised for us a number of years ago, which we were able to then put in there. So I've got the quotations from the Herald article, the photographs that were taken, as well as the audio recordings of the
So where did the
speeches.
recordings come from?
Well, they were on reel-to-reels like this.
But I mean, 2NURFM didn't exist.
No. These were recorded at the time by who,
But
I don't know
knows
who. They came into the archives. 2NURFM helped us to digitise, because before the GlamX Lab, that's where we went to digitise things. But we were able, so we can hear their voices now. And the first comments that started coming in was that they're all men, and it's true, they're all men. But from me, from an Italian point of view, I always pretend that when these men are talking in their speeches, they're talking to me as the Italian kid, all right? And for all the women, just pretend they're talking to you as well, because they're talking to professions. And
there was no
just listen to what they were talking. Get through the various little tribes we're in now and listen to what they were saying. And the idea is they were trying to create a link between education, industry, business, right? Training people up in these professions in order to meet the challenges of what was around the corner. I keep thinking to myself, I think we need to apply the same sort of logic to the problems we face now. We need to find out, we've got some pretty big problems, societal, environmental, economic, that we've got to face. What are we doing to tool up? What training are we doing? Can we train? I mean, everything seems to be changing so fast. But these are the sorts of inspirations that you can gain from these recordings, the way they approached it. So once they founded it, then the next thing was towards an autonomous institution. It took them another, 10 years to get autonomy, and that was another story. Then you've got, the Teachers College strand that starts in 1941, and the Conservatorium of Music strand that starts in 1952. So, and also the art school. So you've got those various strands that start to weave themselves into the university story. They all come together in 1989. So we've dubbed these stories the prehistory of the university. So there's two more that are going to be coming through. So anyone that wishes to participate or has input into this sort of stuff, let us know. Every month we want to do something on this theme, and UON 60, either bring some students in to talk about their activities, or talk about any key things, even just talk about where the university's at, where you want it to be at, or what you would like to see. So that's that. And we've had also a screening of Shipwrecked in Sydney that you attended over the weekend. You want to say some words about that?
The National Maritime Centre, and there was probably about 40 people from the community were there, and some Glenn and Tony, Dr Peter Hogan's, who's sort of always been supportive of what we've done in the Hunter. So that was sort of nice to sort of watch it in a Sydney context and how different, sort of significant it is as well, that for the type of the history that we have here. And also a big thank you to Erica Wright, who I know Erica's zoomed in at the moment. She's a working grad learning student that just finished her placement last Friday and worked on the Rosaline Norton archive. And I've just sort of posted just a short bio that Erica put together, and we've got on the Living History side. It's still a bit of a work in progress, so at the March meeting we'll be able to share a little bit more, and Erica zoom in and is welcome to say a few words about her experience and a little bit more about the project. But it's been great to have.
And what's it about?
So Rosaline Norton archive sort of came to us by Professor Margaret Johnson and her interest in classics. And Rosaline was known as the Witch of King's Cross. And so there's a whole story around that whole era that she was active in Sydney.
Ahead of the time, or
Ahead
maybe
of the time. We've got quite a significant archive.
trans artist. Well, that's the story that went around. I mean, she used it in the media after a while because she just looked apart.
Erica, is there anything you wanted to zoom in and say, or you're welcome to come to the following meeting. Oh, here she is.
Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay, well, I just wanted to say a huge thanks for having me for the placement, and I've learned so much, and I'd love to keep learning about archival stuff and being involved in everything you guys do, because I just find it really interesting and really important. So I just wanted to say thanks for having me again, and I can't wait to keep working on the stuff. I've been loving it.
Well, I'm sorry that whatever it was your last day. I kept giving you jobs to do, and not knowing.
That's okay.
I'm very sorry, Erica. It's just because I just got used to seeing you. I just want you to stay. So you're quite welcome.
Yeah, but thank you for all your work.
And your research assistants there too.
Yeah.
So very good.
Yes, my very helpful research assistants. Yeah, making things go a little bit longer than necessary, but you know how it is.
No,
Sometimes you need that reflection.
Johnny, can I speak towards the co-creativity of this wonderful group?
Yes.
I had a couple of, some people here know that I've spent the last couple of years fictionally recreating Newcastle and Muswellbrook and the railway line in between during 1942 for my new novel. But I wanted to thank, in particular, Robert Watson and Ron Barber, two fine fellows of our group here, for their recent help on certain scenes. I just think it's a tribute to the whole creation of Living Histories that it gives this a wonderful opportunity for cross-fertilisation between all our interests. And I know I'm a bit of a fictional pirate of good historical works, but still it is wonderful co-creativity. And I just wanted to thank you all for making it possible by us having this group each year. And I wanted to say it because I think often some of these sidebar co-creative things that happen are not really known unless someone expresses that it's actually happening outside the realm of this hour and a half of power. So thanks to everybody. And as usual, thanks to Doug Lithgow for always inspiring me. I see you there. Did you just give me the finger, Doug? Oh, no, that's all right. The happy finger. That's good. Okay, mate, I'm sorry. I thought I freaked you out late last year because Johnny had me up behind you in this giant screen and I was looking over your shoulder when you were in the room. Anyway, my friends, that was just my contribution, was to salute the co-creative opportunities that we have, and not just in terms of my novel writing. It also existed with Yallowa Place and the commemorative park in Carrington with respect to victims of the AIDS epidemic. So I think it's just full of wonderful co-creative opportunity. And we all know that I think that Anne and Gianni need the word catalyst in bold and in capitals on their business cards and on their doors and such. But it's nevertheless
about 40 years, but look, when God comes through.
Yeah, but I think sometimes we all get a bit laid back about it and we don't really appreciate that a lot of magic happens, but just by virtue of us having this forum where we all get to know each other and get to play a bit. So thank you, everybody. That's me for the day.
Can I do a final shout out and thanks to Mr. Adrian Cutts, who contacted me over the weekend. He drove down from Harvey Bay over the weekend with his sister Renee with some slides from 1970, I think, 74, 75, that were part of the NBN television archive that he purchased on eBay a few years ago, and he specifically wanted to bring them home. So he dropped in this morning. For those that are in the room, we've just put the slides on a table on a light box. They're actually stills and graphics. So Phil spent quite a bit of time with his family in explaining. Adrian's really interested in preserving television history, media history. They're all stills and graphics that went and sort of promoted the midday movie. There is one on the box that I think Andrew Mercado will be interested in. So, yeah, just to thank our community that he'd been following what we've been doing at Climax Lab for a long time. So he knew us and he reached out. So I just said to him I'd acknowledge him today because he was going to try to be here, stay a bit longer, but he's got to head back.
Yeah, so that's a fellow that cares about our history so much to drive it down here. So yes, good on you. Round of applause. If you get a chance, have a look at the video recording of the founding fathers and mothers with extra mothers, thanks to Judy. Jude. So look, it was very haunting to do it because the room, we're still in the room today, but all those voices since that time have gone. So all of them have left us, but their laughter, their memories and their thoughts of the early university, teachers, college, con live on in that recording. So if you get a chance, have a look at it. Also, a conservator has written a piece on the Getty that was in danger of burning down during the recent LA fires. So if you get a chance, read the advice, the lessons learnt in keeping things precious in these very volatile times. Anne's put up the cultural mapping work project from last year, and also our annual report was finalised with fresh statistics, including December's. So,
can I scrape something in?
Yes.
I have done a talk on Beryl Nasher, and the reason it's relevant to say now, she was the first female academic at the University of Newcastle College.
First dean of science in Australia, first female dean.
My talk was recorded by the Newcastle Family History Society and is online. And Beryl Nasher's son has just got in touch with us. And I haven't rung him yet. He's given me his phone number. So I'm going to ring him and I assume he'll have some information to tell me, or maybe he'll correct some mistakes.
Maybe a UON 60 presentation, Jude, is if you could pull together stuff on significant women across these 60 years. Could you do something like
maybe
that?
I can ask Charity if he's got anything he wants to say.
Yeah.
I transcribed the interview with Beryl Nasher, remember?
That would be
That
fantastic.
might be her.
I used that in
have you?
I used that.
And Harry is been responsible for transcribing some of the most complicated Scottish words from the early 1800s.
Yes.
Given your Germanic background, I find that absolutely amazing.
Very useful.
And she's recently transcribed also the Cole Trimmer's diary from Carrington. So we'll be trying to get that up very soon. So I'll just end this Hunter Living Histories showcase, the first of 2025, with a round of applause for Karen. Thank you all very much. Unless someone's got something burning they need to let us know before March,